At 7:18 p.m., the dining room smelled like reheated pot roast nobody was eating. My mother sat at the head of the table, hands folded like she was about to say grace. My sister sat beside her, arms crossed, already smiling like she knew the ending before anyone spoke. I sat across from both of them, the way I always had, the way some part of me still believed I always would. "Maya, this conversation is over," my mother said. "This house isn't yours. Pack your things." I felt it in my chest before I felt it anywhere else, that specific drop, like missing a stair in the dark. Nobody else at the table flinched. Only me, and only on the inside, where nobody could see how hard my heart was suddenly working. Renee laughed, that short, sharp laugh she'd perfected over a lifetime of moments she thought she'd already won. "Where exactly do you think you're going to argue that?" I didn't answer right away. I let the silence sit there, heavy and unfamiliar, because for years I had filled silences like that one with apologies I didn't owe anyone. My hands were shaking slightly under the table. I don't think anyone noticed. I'm not even sure I wanted them to. "I'm not going to argue," I said, and my voice came out smaller than I meant it to. My mother's shoulders relaxed. She thought that meant I was folding. Some tired, obedient part of me almost did. Instead, I reached into my bag. My hands weren't as steady as I wanted them to be, but they were steady enough. I pulled out a manila folder, its edges soft from being touched too many nights in a row over the last few weeks, and set it down between the untouched coffee cups. "You should probably read this first," I said, and my throat tightened around every word. My mother looked at the folder like it might bite her. Renee's smile hadn't moved yet, but her eyes had. I opened it myself, because I knew neither of them would, and because some part of me needed to be the one to do it, after everything. The deed. Not her name. Not Renee's. Mine. I watched my mother's eyes drop to the paper, then rise, then drop again, like she was hoping a second reading might rewrite it. Renee leaned over her shoulder, and for the first time all evening, she wasn't laughing. I want to tell you I felt triumphant in that moment. I didn't. I felt like I was watching something break that I'd spent my whole life trying to hold together, and I hated that even now, even here, some small foolish part of me still wished I didn't have to be the one holding the paper that broke it. My mother's mouth opened, then closed. She recognized the signature at the bottom. Of course she did. She'd stood right beside me when I signed it. Nobody said the word deed out loud. Nobody needed to. It sat there, doing the talking none of us seemed able to do for ourselves, while I quietly tried to remember how to breathe normally. But if you want to understand why one piece of paper could make my chest ache like that, you have to go back to a time when I still believed my family would never make me choose between them and myself. The house smelled like cinnamon most Sunday mornings, because my mother believed a home wasn't really a home unless something was baking in it. I grew up in that kitchen, standing on a wobbly step stool, learning to fold batter slow and patient, the way she folded it, like the recipe itself deserved something close to reverence. Down the hallway hung a row of photographs that told our family's story in order. Me at 6, missing my front teeth, gap-toothed and unbothered. Renee at 4, refusing to smile for anyone, arms crossed even then. My father, in the years before he became mostly a memory, laughing at something just out of frame, his hand resting on my mother's shoulder like he intended to stay there forever. My bedroom window faced east. On nights when sleep wouldn't come, I used to sit there and watch the streetlights flicker on one by one, feeling something I didn't have a word for yet, something between loneliness and safety. That house held every version of me I'd ever been. It wasn't just a building. It was proof, physical and undeniable, that I belonged somewhere, that I mattered to someone. My mother used to say it constantly in that soft, certain voice she saved for promises. "No matter what happens, this will always be your home." I believed her completely, the way children believe the sky is permanent, the way you believe things before life teaches you that even permanence has terms and conditions. Renee used to tease me about being Mom's favorite, and maybe I was, for a while, though it never felt like a prize. I was the one who stayed close after our father passed, who picked up extra shifts to help with bills nobody discussed at dinner, who learned far too young that being needed and being loved could feel identical from the inside. close enough that you stopped bothering to tell them apart. By my late 20s, I'd built something of my own, quietly, the way I did most things. A career I was proud of. Savings that came from years of saying no to things I wanted so I could say yes to things that mattered more. When circumstances I still don't like revisiting made it necessary for the house to have a new legal owner on paper, my mother didn't hesitate. "You're the one who's kept this family standing," she told me, sliding the paperwork across the table like it was nothing more than a formality, her eyes wet in a way that made my own throat tighten. "It should be yours. Officially." I remember crying a little in the car afterward, not from joy exactly, more from the overwhelming relief of finally being seen. I didn't parade the deed around. I filed it away in a drawer I rarely opened, because owning the house never felt like the point to me. Belonging to my family felt like the point. It always had. Looking back, there were moments I should have let hurt more than I let them. At the time, I called them family habits because calling them something else felt too frightening to survive. My mother started saying family property instead of your house, and I told myself the wording didn't matter, even as something in me quietly flinched every time. She began asking about my finances more, wrapped in concern, always circling back to control. "Just making sure you're being smart with your money," she'd say, right after asking exactly how much I had left over each month, and I'd answer honestly, because some habits of obedience run deeper than logic. Renee started treating the house differently too, in small ways I swallowed instead of naming. She rearranged furniture without asking. She had friends over like it was hers. I told myself she was just comfortable. I didn't want to believe my family was changing, so I let myself stay blind to the parts of them that already had. I thought those comments were harmless. I thought the house represented everything my family had built together. I didn't understand yet that years later, my mother would use that very same house to tell me I had no place inside it. The first strange conversation happened over something as small as a couch. I came home to new furniture in the living room, dark leather instead of the faded blue sectional that had sat there for a decade. "Why is Renee choosing furniture for my house?" I asked, more confused than angry, still willing to believe there was an easy explanation. "Our house," my mother corrected, not even looking up from her phone. I paused. It was such a small word, but it landed somewhere soft and unguarded in me, somewhere I didn't know was still that easy to bruise. "Don't make everything about ownership," she added, like I was the unreasonable one, and something in me quietly apologized for a crime I hadn't committed. I let it go. That was the first warning. I ignored it, the way you ignore the ache in your chest, because naming it feels scarier than the ache itself. Weeks later, I overheard Renee on the phone, talking about paint colors for when I move into the master bedroom eventually. I stood frozen in the hallway, waiting for her to correct herself. She never did. Something in me went very still and very cold. That wasn't the worst part. Small packages addressed to Renee began arriving for the house. Renovation catalogs. Paint swatches. A folder of her own, filled with ideas for a home she didn't own, sitting out in plain sight like she'd never once considered I might see it. I finally spoke to my mother directly, my voice trembling more than I wanted it to. "Mom, the deed is in my name," I said. "Because we trusted you," she said, like that explained everything, like trust and ownership were the same soft, negotiable thing. "That's not what the document says," I told her, hating how much it cost me to say it. "You're being difficult," she said, turning back to the sink, and I felt something crack quietly in my chest, the particular ache of being dismissed by the one person whose approval I had never stopped needing, even now, even at 28, even after everything. Renee cornered me days later, less careful with her words. "You weren't even planning to live here forever," she said. "That doesn't mean you get to decide what happens to it," I said, my eyes stinging in a way I refused to let show. "Mom already told me the plan," she shot back, and the floor seemed to shift under that sentence. A plan. Since when was there a plan I wasn't part of, in a house that legally, undeniably, belonged to me? I tried once more to fix things before they hardened into something permanent. "I don't want this to become a fight," I told my mother, my voice cracking on the last word. Then stop making it one, she said, and I went in my room afterward and cried in a way I hadn't let myself cry in years, quiet and folded into myself, so no one downstairs would hear. What I didn't know was that my sister had already made real plans for a house she didn't own. Contractors. Timelines. Conversations with relatives that never once included me. And then I found the one thing I couldn't cry my way around. A folder, almost identical to my own, filled with printed floor plans and a note in Renee's handwriting, after Maya moves out. Not if. After. I sat on the floor of my closet holding that piece of paper for a long time, feeling something in me finally, quietly, give way. I pulled my own documents from the drawer where they'd sat for years and confirmed, again, what I already knew. Signed. Notarized. Mine. I confronted my mother privately, hoping honesty in private might produce honesty back. You understand this is my house, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Legally. Not emotionally. Legally. That paperwork was just something between family members, she said, waving her hand, and that phrase lodged itself somewhere deep and stayed there. Just something between family members. As if the truth bent depending on who found it inconvenient. She reframed my ownership as betrayal in the span of one conversation. After everything I sacrificed for this family, you're going to hide behind paperwork, she said, and I felt tears rise before I could stop them, guilty despite having done absolutely nothing wrong. That's the quiet, terrible power certain people hold over you. They can make your own name on your own document feel like a wound you inflicted on them. I offered compromise anyway, because some habits of love take longer to unlearn than others. No sudden changes. No confrontation. Just space to figure things out. Mom refused. Renee refused. Relatives began taking quiet sides without ever fully admitting they had. Slowly, painfully, I understood this was never really about a house. It was about keeping me small enough to still need permission, still need approval, still need them, the way I had needed them as a girl standing on a wobbly step stool, long before I built anything of my own. I started documenting things after that, my hands often unsteady while I did it. Conversations. Dates. I moved the paperwork somewhere safer than a drawer, somewhere closer to my chest, metaphorically and sometimes literally. I didn't tell anyone, because I wasn't ready to force the truth into a room that clearly preferred a comfortable lie. Then my mother announced a formal family meeting. We need to talk about what happens next, she said, and something in her tone told me the decision had already been made without me. Renee arrived that evening already smiling, already certain. Watching them both, I understood, with a clarity that hurt more than anger would have, that they weren't planning to ask my opinion. They were preparing to remove me. That night, I put the deed into my bag, my hands trembling the entire time. Not because I wanted to humiliate my mother. Not because I wanted revenge. I brought it because, for the first time, I understood that the truth might need to be physically placed on the table before anyone in that house would be willing to hear it. Back at the table at 7:18 p.m., my mother said it again, slower this time, like repetition might finally make it true. This house isn't yours. You're leaving tonight. Are you sure you want to say that? I asked, my voice shaking even as I tried to steady it. Renee laughed. Oh my God, she's actually arguing. I'm not arguing, I said. I placed the deed on the table, my hand trembling visibly now, and I let it tremble, because I was done pretending I felt nothing. I'm showing you, I said. Then silence, thick enough to drown in. My mother's eyes moved across the page twice, like waiting for it to say something kinder the second time. That doesn't mean what you think it means. Then read it, I said, and I heard my own voice crack right down the middle. She read it. Renee read it over her shoulder, her confidence draining out of her face, like watching a light dim rather than switch off. My mother's voice cracked too, when she finally spoke again. This was supposed to stay in the family. I am your family, I said, and my eyes filled despite everything I did to stop them. You know what I mean, she said. No, Mom, I said, barely audible. I think I finally do. Something in the room shifted, bigger than furniture or paperwork. She wasn't fighting for a house anymore. I could see it in the way her hands trembled against the table's edge, in the way her whole face seemed to fold inward. You didn't want me to own this house, I said, my voice breaking completely now. You wanted me to always need permission to stay in it. Nobody spoke. Renee looked between us like she was witnessing a conversation that had been happening underground for years, one she'd never been told existed. My mother's jaw tightened, then loosened, then tightened again, like she was fighting whatever admission was climbing up her throat against her will. I raised you, she finally said, quieter now, anger bleeding into something closer to fear, closer to grief. I sacrificed everything for this family. I know, I said, crying openly now, no longer trying to hide it. That doesn't erase what tonight was supposed to be. Renee tried once more, weaker this time. Maybe the paperwork is old, maybe it doesn't count anymore, maybe. It's legally binding, I said, my voice raw. It was signed. Notarized. It hasn't changed just because it's inconvenient now. My mother looked at the deed once more, then at me, and something in her finally broke open. Not defeat. Something more like recognition, more like grief meeting truth for the first time. I was scared, she admitted, so softly I almost lost it entirely. Scared that if you didn't need me anymore, you wouldn't stay. I didn't respond right away. I let that sentence sit there, heavy and finally, achingly honest, and I let myself cry for both of us, for the years it took to say it. You didn't have to make me leave to keep me close, I said. You just had to trust that I'd choose to stay. Nobody packed my suitcase that night. Nobody dragged me to the door. The only thing actually removed from that room was the illusion that my mother could decide where I belonged, and I sat there afterward, quietly shaking, grieving something I couldn't fully name. Nothing about the weeks that followed felt like winning. I spent the first night sitting on my bedroom floor, the same room I'd grown up in, staring at a folder I no longer needed to hide, crying in a way that felt less like sadness and more like release, like something long held finally allowed to leave my body. Renee quietly abandoned her renovation plans. The floor plans disappeared from the counter she used to leave them on so proudly. She didn't apologize directly, but she stopped talking about the master bedroom like it already belonged to her. My mother became distant in a way that ached more than her anger ever had. Fewer calls. Shorter conversations. Like she needed space to figure out who she was now that control was no longer an option, and some nights I missed her so much it surprised me, even after everything. Relatives had opinions, because relatives always do. One aunt pulled me aside at a birthday party and said, "Can't you just forget what happened?" Forgetting isn't the same as forgiving, I told her, my voice steadier than I expected, though my hands weren't. Renee asked me weeks later, arms crossed the way they always were when she felt cornered. "So you're really keeping the house?" "I never took it from you," I said gently. "It was never yours to lose." I built boundaries slowly, without turning them into weapons, though some days it took everything in me not to. I wasn't interested in revenge. I was interested, finally, in being believed. Weeks passed quietly, without any music underneath them. I went back to ordinary routines inside the house, cooking in the same kitchen, sitting by the same window, feeling something shift beneath the familiarity, something that finally felt like mine, not just on paper, but somewhere deeper. Then, 3 months later, my mother called and asked something she'd never once asked in her life. "Would you mind if we talked about the house?" she said. I had an idea, but I wanted to ask first. I sat with that sentence for a long time, tears coming again, quieter this time, gentler. Asking first. Such a small thing. Such an enormous thing. I don't think we'll ever go back to exactly what we were, and I've stopped needing that to feel like a tragedy. Some relationships aren't meant to return to their old shape. Some are meant to find a new one, smaller maybe, but honest and mine. For years I thought keeping my family close meant keeping the peace, even at the cost of myself. Months later, I finally understood that peace only becomes real once you stop pretending nothing is wrong. I've thought a lot about that phrase my mother used to say. "This will always be your home." I don't think she was lying when she said it. I think she never realized that home, to her, meant a place where I'd always need her permission to stay, and that difference nearly cost me everything I'd built. I'm not going to pretend she was a villain in every version of this story, because she wasn't, and pretending otherwise would be its own kind of dishonesty. She taught me how to fold batter and how to show up for people even when it cost her something. Those sacrifices were real, even after her fear twisted them into something else. Good memories don't erase unhealthy behavior. Both can be true, and living inside that truth is harder than any argument about paperwork. The deed didn't make me strong. It just gave physical proof to something I had to learn slowly, painfully, with tears I didn't always let anyone see. Being someone's daughter was never supposed to mean surrendering my right to my own life. I kept records and protected my paperwork not because I wanted a war, but because I finally understood that some people only respect a boundary once they can see it written down in ink they can't argue with. If you've ever been told that protecting yourself means you don't love your family, you already understand the hardest part of this story, and I'm sorry, genuinely, that you know it too. Have you ever had someone you loved treat your independence like a betrayal? I'd really like to know how you carried it, whether you spoke up right away or waited, the way I did, for a moment you finally couldn't swallow anymore. I didn't need my family to agree with me anymore. I needed to stop abandoning myself just to keep them comfortable. The house was never really what I was fighting for. I was fighting for the right to feel like my own life belonged to me, even when the people I loved most couldn't stand the answer.